Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our memory demo. Now, our memory demo is part of a larger series of videos focusing on the fundamentals of the Java programming language. But these particular videos are going to look at how Java perhaps is a little different from other languages, or at least how Java handles memory management. Now, this is going to cover a number of topics, but in this particular video, we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to look at what happens when you pass an integer object to a function, and a couple of different ways to handle then the results of an operation inside of a function. So to begin with, this video assumes that you've set up your memory demo as either a separate project or as part of the fundamentals demo. In my case, I went ahead and made it part of the fundamentals demo. However, I did add a main that allows for my memory demo to be runnable from the command line inside the fundamentals demo project. If you've not yet had a chance to do so, I encourage you to take a look at the setup video as part of this series. You'll also notice here that I have a couple of function signatures, and you're probably wondering where in the world those come from. I'll try to leave those in the comments section. If not, take a second to pause the video and then just go ahead and get these two function signatures started. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do in this video. So the idea here is I have basically two fairly innocuous functions. They don't do a whole lot. You'll notice that they're both public static, which means that I can just run them without creating an instance of my memory demo. And you'll also notice the first one then allows for us to accept an integer input value, particularly an integer object. I went ahead and opted for this particular demo to go ahead and use integer objects. We'll talk about the differences between an integer object and an integer primitive in another video, but you'll notice that it returns a void. In other words, it returns nothing. In other words, I'm not going to get any output from this function. In my second function, I also accept an integer object, but unlike the first one, I also returned an integer object. So what we want to do is we want to understand what happens when you pass an integer to these two functions. So to begin with, let's have some trivial operation inside of these functions. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to set this up then as input equal to input plus 1. And again, I could go ahead and use the shorthand notation here, which I'll simply leave in my comment here of input plus plus. Either is fine, doesn't really matter. But the key thing is we want to know what the value is that was passed to our function. And we're simply going to do that by providing it a system.out.println. And we're going to make some noise here. I'm going to remove my double quotes, and I simply want to know what is the value of the input before the operation as well as after the operation. Now, I'm going to do somewhat of the same thing in our second example, in our second function, except for the difference is I want to have a return value, which means that I can go ahead and create a local variable that, again, I'm going to have be an integer, and I'm going to call this one results, and I can go ahead and initialize it to a 0 if we want to, but nonetheless here what I want to do is I want to say results are going to be equal to input plus 1, and then ultimately I want to return my results. Now again, much like in the earlier example, I want to create a little noise inside of this function here, and I'm simply going to do a system.out.println first for the input, but then as you can imagine, that doesn't really change. So what we'd like to do is have that also be for the results. Again, this is just a way for us to see what's actually going on inside of our function. Additionally, you can go ahead and learn how to debug and put a breakpoint on some of these lines. But now let's get to actually calling these two functions and the heart of this video. And again, this sort of gets us started with our memory demo. In the earlier video, we set this up with a demo switch, which we can use then in later videos. But what I want to do is I want to use this now as somewhat of a template, if you would, for the two examples that I want to do in this video. So I'm just going to go ahead and start by copying and pasting that line. Again, make sure to get your tabs lined up correctly. And I'm going to use then the function names as my switches. So for this first example, then I want to have my UpdateInt. And for the second example, I want to have my UpdateIntWithReturn. UpdateInt with return. Now, what do we actually want to do in each of these examples? Well, in Java, much like in C, when you pass an argument to a function, it is passed by val. In other words, basically what happens is a copy of the variable is made for use inside the function. Now, unfortunately, unlike in C, I can't really show you the memory addresses. We'll take a look in a later video, sort of a little bit of a hack way of going about understanding the differences about the variable outside the function and inside the function. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate that principle here by creating some locally scoped variables inside of our else if branch. I'm going to start off with an int, and I'm going to simply call it my input value. And I'm going to initialize it. In this case, I'm going to initialize it to 0. Not very interesting here. But what I want to do then is I want to make a call to my UpdateInt function. And my UpdateInt accepts an input integer. And much like as I did inside of my UpdateInt function, I also want to take a second to go ahead and do a system.out.println and accidentally tabbed too quick there. All I want to have is my input. Now, this is going to get a little confusing pretty quick here. So why don't I take a second to add a little more noise here. And then I'm just going to call this, or rather put a outside, meaning this is in the calling function. And for the function itself, then I'll simply specify then that this is inside. And again, you can put whatever other noise you would like to be able to differentiate between the two inside of each of your helper functions. And again, because we've gotten started on this, might as well go ahead and do this with the other function as well. But the idea here is you're going to be able to differentiate between the system.out.println that's being called here in my main and the ones that are being called inside of my little helper functions. Now, at this point, I think I've pretty much got this example set up the way that I want to have it set up. So I'm going to go ahead and build it. And what we'll do is we'll come out here to our command line, and we can just simply run our Java E333.MemoryDemo with, of course, the correct switch. And if you've forgotten what that is, well, you can just bounce back over here and you'll see that it's our UpdateInt that we're wishing to test. So in this case, you'll see that outside the function, of course, the value of 0. And then when I pass it to the function, let me see if I can get this both here on the same screen for us. That's probably close enough. And so you can see that I start off with value of 0, and I pass it to my function here, my UpdateInt, and it goes and displays it as being the inside value is also 0. Then I add 1 to it. And then, of course, inside the value becomes 1. But notice back here on the outside that no changes happen. And so you'll notice here that effectively I'm working with a copy of my input integer inside of my UpdateInt. Now you're probably wondering here, why did I use an int instead of an integer, and does it really matter? Well, let's go ahead and see real quick if it does. I'm going to go ahead and leave that here. I'm going to go ahead and build it. And then we can come back out here and you'll see that, in fact, if I rerun this, well, it doesn't really change my results any. Now, again, we're going to focus on the differences between an int and an integer in a later video. But the key thing here is that I'm getting a copy of the variable for use inside of my little helper function. Essentially, that means that any changes I make inside of that helper function do not get transferred outside back to the calling function, which brings us to the second example that we want to take a look at. And that is, if I pass an integer to a function, would I like to get the updated value? And if the answer is yes, well, then I simply have to include it then in the return value for the function. That's exactly what I've done here. And what we can do is we can simply then test our second version. And again, we could probably save a little bit of time by doing a little bit of creative copying and pasting here. And what we will do is we will change our UpdateInt to UpdateIntWithReturn. And then while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and get another variable, which I will simply call results. Now you can technically go ahead and reuse your input variable, but I like to go ahead and have some extra variables laying around. And in this case, then we will have our results variable will be what captures the return from our UpdateInt. And I'm going to take the extra step of doing another system.out.println with my results variable as well as my input variable. Now, if you've been following along with my example here, you could probably guess that my input variable will in fact not change, and we can just simply change our command line switch to UpdateInt with return to match our switch. And sure enough, you'll notice that outside the value starts off as 0 for my input. Inside, it starts off as 0. And then again, with the inside, notice I'm not making any changes. Sorry, let me scroll down here. Not making any changes to the input variable. So sure enough, that does in fact not change. Could take the extra step of actually specifying which variable that we have here. Might as well, just to make our example a little bit clearer for you to see. There's our input. And again, our input one more time. And then lastly, our results. Now, if you're comfortable with debugging, you can also verify this using a debug instance. But again, we're going to keep this one simple, and you'll see that, in fact, the input variable does not change value because of how I'm doing the operation of adding 1 to it. But my results variable does change, so now it's 1. And then outside in the calling function, my input value does in fact remain 0 while my results variable is updated. Now, absolutely none of this should be surprising to you with respect to working with Java, because it is going to be fairly similar in other languages. C, of course, allows for you to pass a value or variable by reference and lets you update the variable inside of a function. And what we're going to see is that it's not really that easy to do that in Java. There are going to be some examples of where you can do that, but for right now, you just want to remember that you're passing the variables by value. And essentially what happens is a copy of the variable is made inside the function. So as always, if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.